I want to begin by paying tribute to the work of Joe and Barbara and the work of Hey Ho. I think it's a really important part of the local community, thinking about how we reflect on the past and thinking about the commemorations of the First World War. Ladies and gentlemen, after the defeat of the Allied forces at Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the commanding general of the Ottoman forces during the Dardanelles campaign and later president of the Republic of Turkey, said in honour of the Allied war dead, including many from the North Staffordshire regiments, "Heroes who shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and Mehmets to us where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well." No better tribute could be paid to the bravery and sacrifice of young men who served their country in the volunteer battalions of the North Staffordshire regiments. Potters, steel workers, coal miners, navvies, clerks, managers and pot bank owners all put their lives at risk at the front and often paid the ultimate sacrifice in service of their country and for the defence of democracy and international law. Therefore, the centenary commemorations for the First World War this year, combined with last month's 70th anniversary of the D-Day landings, provides us with a unique opportunity to reacquaint ourselves with our not too distant past, to discover the role of the potteries during the events of the 20th century, both the horrors and the triumphs, the sacrifices endured and the victories won. This century of conflict, what Eric Hobsbawm famously called the age of extremes, shaped our contemporary world. Indeed, the necessity of what the First World War should mean to us and how we approach this subject has become something of an ideological battlefield with the intervention of my former opposite number, Michael Gove, and how enjoyable it is to say those words. While the centenary commemorations this year offer an opportunity to engage all age groups and sections of society in a careful reappraisal of the Great War and Britain's role in its outbreak and prosecution, the former Education Secretary chose instead to open up what I felt was a more divisive front in the historical discussion about this monumental chapter in our island history. Presenting a caricatured version of Max Hastings' thesis that the conflict was simply a struggle against German tyranny, Michael Gove chose the pages of the Daily Mail to call for, quotes, "the battling of left-wing myths that belittle Britain," and to denounce historians who he deemed to be denigrating patriotism, which was not, in my view, the most consensual or reflective way to think about the 1914 to 18 commemorations. This Govian interpretation of the First World War fails to take account of the wealth of work of more recent scholarship, historians as diverse as Neil Ferguson and Christopher Clark. In Clark's judgment, any attempt at a First World War blame game is futile. He wrote, "The outbreak of war is not an Agatha Christie drama, at the end of which we will discover the culprit standing over a corpse in a conservatory with a smoking pistol. There is no smoking gun in this story, or rather, there is one in the hands of every major character." But to dispute Clark, Michael Gove did find his culprit, and it was, of course, Baldrick. Denouncing the much-loved television comedy series Blackadder, he accused the show of denigrating patriotism and courage by propagating myths by left-wing academics. As I shall demonstrate, those men from the potteries who went to war in 1914, many of them left-wingers and trade unionists, needed no lectures from the Education Secretary on the virtues of patriotism. But regardless of the differing views that many are sure to have about this cataclysm from our nation's past, the centenary is surely a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reflect on events with thoughtful contemplation and academic rigour. It is a chance for us to reassess a conflict that so fundamentally changed what it meant to be British, from the role of the state to the changing role of women in society. So this evening I want to talk about the role of the potteries during the First World War, its people, and how the sacrifices made by people of all walks of life, both at home and at the front, demonstrated a patriotic spirit in the potteries that spans a period of time encompassing, yes, the battlefields of the Somme, but also the resurrection of Lidice after the Second World War and the brave sacrifices of the men and women of the 3rd Battalion of the Mercian Regiment in Afghanistan most recently. Throughout all of these struggles, the potteries has distinguished itself as an exemplar of British virtues of bravery, freedom and tolerance. The outbreak of war swept all people involved into the concept of total war, and the potteries and its supporting industries were no different. During the Great War, this area witnessed an outpouring of patriotic fervour, and thousands of young men, many who worked in the local pot banks, answered the call of Lord Kitchener to avenge the rape of Belgium. The potteries industry in particular exhibited an enthusiastic spirit of patriotism by utilising its central part in British economic and social life to produce an abundance of patriotic-themed ceramics that range from novelty egg cups to the wartime ware of Wedgwood. While the advent of war brought about a deep economic slump across Europe, the pottery industry experienced a revival from a period that had, up until that point, represented a low point in the sale of North Staffordshire ceramics due to the imports of cheap ceramics from Germany. Indeed, the leading pottery manufacturers of the area had spent the previous decade calling for action to be taken to restrict German ceramic imports, and therefore could rightly claim to have long warned of the dangers of the encroaching influence of Prussianism in Britain. Amongst the most preeminent of the pottery manufacturers, since the beginnings in fact, was of course the Wedgwood family. As local worthies, the Wedgwoods not only employed a large population in North Staffordshire, they also were political and civic leaders who showed leadership through their actions. One such exemplar was Cecil Wedgwood. Major Wedgwood, first son of Godfrey Wedgwood and Mary Jane Jackson Hawkshaw, first saw military service during the Boer War as part of the 4th Militia Battalion North Staffordshire Regiment, where his actions during that conflict gained him a Distinguished Service Medal. After the war in South Africa, Cecil took up his familial role as a partner in the famous family business, which eventually saw him rise to chairman of the board and managing director. Through his dedication to local civic duty, he became the first Lord Mayor of the newly incorporated city of Stoke-on-Trent. By the time of the outbreaks of hostilities in the summer of 1914, he was 51 years of age. But Cecil eagerly offered his service to king and country in its hour of need. However, he was turned down for active military service by the army. Undeterred, Cecil Wedgwood set about raising his own battalion of volunteers from the pot banks to fight on the Western Front, the 8th Battalion North Staffordshire Regiment, popularly known as the Potters. As part of 19th Division, they saw action on the second day of the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. Tasked with advancing into La Boisselle to link up with the remaining units of the Tyneside Scottish that had received such heavy losses on the first day of battle. Leading his men over the top to the rallying cry of "Come on you Potters," Major Wedgwood and the 8th Battalion helped achieve the objective of taking La Boisselle and securing it from German hands. However, despite achieving their objectives, the 8th Battalion sustained heavy losses on the second day of battle, and one amongst the fallen was Major Cecil Wedgwood himself. The sacrifices of the men of the 8th Battalion North Staffordshire Regiments on the second day of the Battle of the Somme, a battle that would last for a further 3 gruelling months, like so many thousands who gave their lives during that battle, have been described by many, particularly by Neil Ferguson in his book The Pity of War, as representing the futility of the conflict that raged between 1914 and 18. However, I believe that many of those sacrifices made by pot bank workers, coal miners and civic leaders also represent a spirit of sacrifice and solidarity that spans through the history of the potteries. Indeed, when one considers the number of commendations, medals and honours bestowed upon fighting men from the potteries, what is clear is that the Potters never shied away from battle and committed acts of unbelievable heroism. To list just a few recipients of military medals and distinctions from Stoke-on-Trent during the First World War alone demonstrates that the Potteries did not lack a wealth of brave and heroic individuals who were willing to sacrifice their lives for king, country and empire to defend the weak and the oppressed from what they regarded as imperialist aggression. Such individuals like Percy Bolton, a flying ace who was born in Hanley in 1898. He signed up for the front when he was old enough and eventually joined the Royal Flying Corps in 1918 and took part in 6 major air battles that won him the Distinguished Flying Cross. Or Wilfrid Green, who flew in 7 major air battles and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, as well as the Légion d'honneur and the Croix de Guerre from our French allies for his heroism in the skies over France and Belgium. Similarly, John Harold Rhodes, born in Packmore in 1891, went to school in Newchapel before going to work in Chatley-Whitfield Colliery. In 1910, he joined the Grenadier Guards for 3 years before returning briefly to the pits, a job rapidly interrupted by the outbreak of hostilities in 1914. He returned to military service as a reservist and Lance Sergeant in the 3rd Battalion of the Grenadier Guards, being awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal in 1915. However, it would be his actions of the Battle of Pearl Capella in 1917 that would earn him his Victoria Cross. To quote from the commendation, "For most conspicuous bravery when in charge of a Lewis gun section covering the consolidation of the right front company. He accounted for several enemy with his rifle as well as by Lewis gunfire, and upon seeing 3 enemy leave a pill box, he went out single-handed through our own barrage and hostile machine gun fire, and effected an entry into the pillbox. He there captured 9 enemy, including a forward observation officer connected by telephone with his battery. These prisoners he brought back with him, together with valuable information." Another local hero and Victoria Cross recipient, Ernest Albert Egerton, joined up as a 19-year-old corporal in the 16th Battalion, Nottingham and Derbyshire Regiment, popularly referred to as the Sherwood Foresters. It was at the Battle of Passchendaele that he demonstrated the bravery so evident amongst the North Staffordshire regiments. On the 20th September 1917, Corporal Egerton took part in an engagement south of Ypres. As dispatches recounted shortly after the event, during an attack, visibility was bad owing to fog and smoke. As a result, the 2 leading waves of the attack passed over certain hostile dugouts without clearing them, and enemy rifles and machine guns from these dugouts were inflicting severe casualties. Corporal Egerton at once responded to a call for volunteers to help in clearing up the situation, and he dashed for the dugouts under heavy fire at short range. He shot a rifleman, a bomber and a gunner, by which time support had arrived and 29 of the enemy surrendered. For these actions, Corporal Egerton rightly deserved the highest military award our nation could bestow. As the war progressed, he was elevated to the rank of sergeant, and even after the Great War was long over, Sergeant Egerton once again answered his country's call to arms by joining the Home Guard in the Second World War, living up to Douglas MacArthur's parting words, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." As I've spoken earlier of the heroism of the 8th Battalion North Staffordshire Regiment at the Battle of the Somme, I think it would be remiss of me not to cite the heroism of one particular individual of the 8th North Staffords, Sergeant Oswald Dale. Born in Longton and worked as a miner before he was called up as a Territorial Army reservist in 1914. Marked out for a leadership role by his battalion's commanders, he was quickly promoted to sergeant at the barracks at Lichfield before shipping out to France in 1915. At the Battle of the Somme, the 8th Battalion was thrown into the centre of the white-hot heat of battle, as German trenches, thought to have been cleared by weeks of Allied artillery bombardment. And I always remember the stories of people climbing Parliament Hill in London, one of the highest points in London, and listening to the bombardment from London to mark the advent of the beginnings of the Battle of the Somme, that this notion that was so thunderous they thought they could hear it there. The German trenches, thought to have been cleared by weeks of Allied artillery bombardment, fought back with a ferocious hail of rifle and machine gun fire. On the first day of battle, Sergeant Dale's unit was sustaining heavy casualties and impeded progress towards their objective, the village of La Boisselle. His unit needed swift, decisive and bold action to ensure their relative safe passage to their objective in enemy-held territory. Without fear for personal injury or death at the hands of the enemy, Sergeant Dale single-handedly charged a German machine gun nest, subduing the enemy and thus allowing his men to advance to La Boisselle. This brave and heroic act won him the admiration of his men, who after the battle carried him aloft on their shoulders in celebration, and a citation from his superior officer urging that he be decorated with the Victoria Cross. However, not all of the experiences of the First World War by the Potteries was to be felt by those on the front line through battles, medals, citations, and yes, fatalities. The latter of these would also be experienced by those loved ones left behind at home who would experience the trauma that the dreaded information from the War Office would bring the news of a lost loved one serving at the front. In November of 1864, a Miss Lydia Bixby of Boston, America, famously received an official letter offering condolences and at least some consolation in the recent loss of her 5 sons during the American Civil War that had so savagely torn her country in two. It read, "Dear Madam, I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, Abraham Lincoln." For Mrs. Taylor of Northwood, there would be no such letter to beguile her from the grief of a loss so overwhelming, nor would she receive such consolation for the sacrifice she had made as a mother upon the altar of freedom. No, Mrs. Taylor and her family would be unable to find respite from the horrors of the war at home. The armistice on the 11th of November 1918 may have been cause for the whole city of Stoke-on-Trent to celebrate, but I doubt the ending of hostilities gave much comfort for the Taylor family. 4 of the Taylor brothers served with the 7th Battalion North Staffordshire Regiment. Jessie died on the hospital ship heading back from Gallipoli, George in Mesopotamia, Arthur at the Somme, and her youngest Thomas at Hazebrouck. George's name now resides on the Basma Memorial in modern-day Iraq, a poignant link to our present when men from North Staffordshire have once again fought on familiar terrain. In this one family, we see firsthand the devastating losses that would be inflicted upon countless families across the Potteries and North Staffordshire. But the resolve that each of these families and their sons, brothers and fathers serving at the front met such trauma was characteristic of the stoic resilience of the Potteries during an epoch of war. The service records of our local battalions speak to the valour and self-sacrifice of its people from all walks of life. To list the battles and engagements of Potteries battalions, such as the 5th and 8th battalions of the North Staffordshire, is to provide a roll call of poignant place names that are forever remembered as hallowed ground: the Somme, Ypres, Saint-Quentin, Gallipoli. One such battle that saw active participation by Potters battalions, now so infamous in our collective imaginations due to the sheer horror of the slaughter in the autumn mud of 1917, was the 3rd Battle of Ypres, or more commonly known today simply as Passchendaele. Indeed, so infamous is its place in history that it remains a point of contention amongst politicians, generals and commentators of the period and historians of today. In his memoirs some 20 years after the events of the First World War, Prime Minister David Lloyd George declared that, quote, Passchendaele was indeed one of the greatest disasters of the war. No soldier of any intelligence now defends this senseless campaign. However, other voices have argued that the offensive was vital in holding German forces down in Flanders so that other operations in places such as Cambrai would be provided valuable breathing room to succeed. But whatever the verdict that history should ultimately bestow upon Passchendaele, if any at all, what is clear is that the immense loss of life surely places it in one of the worst brutal engagements of the First World War. And it was North Staffordshire battalions that bore the brunt of these heavy losses throughout the 3-month Allied offensive in 1917. During the twilight hours of the morning of July the 1st, 1917, men from the North Staffordshire battalions awaited the commencement of the Allied offensive of British, Empire, French and Belgian forces with apprehension but determination. Allied artillery fire thundered overhead and bombarded the German defensive lines with merciless ferocity. The purpose of this intense, ear-splitting barrage was designed, like so many failed offensives before it, to rip open the enemy lines and pave the way for Allied forces to roll up the German resistance. Like the Somme before it, Allied commanders still believed Napoleonic tactics of artillery bombardments followed by amassing your men and bringing superior numbers to bear would bring victory. Unfortunately, for many thousands of men in those Allied trenches, many of them from North Staffordshire, these outdated tactics would prove to be little defence against the enemy. Following the cessation of the Allied bombardment, British troops fixed bayonets and went over the top. Amongst them, the men of the 1st Battalion, North Staffordshire, charged into the jungle of twisted metal, rusted barbed wire and hollowed shell craters that was no man's land. As the 1st North Staffords advanced further towards the enemy trenches, there was the palpable sense that the best laid plans were coming apart at the seams. The further they progressed, the higher the rate of fire, increasing from German defensive positions. Advancing through the mud with 80 pounds of equipment, the 1st North Staffords had lost all of C&B companies halfway across no man's land. Despite sustaining such losses within the first moments of the attack, the 1st Staffords reached their objective in the area around Hill 60, known as Jehovah's Trench. All that remained was D Company, 2 officers, and the battalion's 3 forward units. Despite this destruction, the Staffords captured their objective trench and held it against enemy counterattacks and inhospitable conditions without food, sleep, or reinforcements. A death toll consisting of 11 officers, 238 non-commissioned officers, and half the battalion's full strength. By the end of the 3rd day of fighting, North and South Staffordshire regimental losses would stand near to the 10,000 mark, which represented a devastatingly high proportion of the Staffordshire men that had been put into the field. The heroism and sacrifice of the 1st Staffords alone resulted in their battalion being awarded 2 military crosses, 3 distinguished conduct medals, 5 military medals, and 1 bar to a military medal. But if there is one engagement that crystallises the futility of trench warfare and the heroism of British Tommies, especially those of the North Staffordshire regiments, then it is the engagement known as the Battle of Hohenzollern that took place during the Battle of Loos in 1915. After the stalemate had set in on the Western Front during the winter of 1914-15, Allied commanders began searching for the next breakthrough that would give them that all-important penetration through the Hindenburg defensive line. With numerical superiority working in the Allied favour, and a third of the German army increasingly occupied with events on the Eastern Front, now seemed the opportunity for the Allies to push their advantage. An almighty artillery barrage against the enemy defensive positions, with the objective of obliterating those fortifications, would again mark the beginning of the initial phase of the offensive, with simultaneous attacks being launched from Champagne and Artois, and forcing the Germans to fight on open ground against a more mobile and numerically superior force. A simple but genius solution to the stalemate on the Western Front. However, as would become all too apparent with unremitting horror in the following years, this would not be the much anticipated breakthrough that Allied commanders would bring forth the final victory. What those commanders, such as Field Marshal Douglas Haig, who Lloyd George would later refer to as the butcher of the Somme, did not realise was that previous French assaults at Vimy Ridge in May and July had left the Germans with the higher ground, which offered a built-in advantage for the defenders. This factor would prove disastrous for the soon-to-be advancing soldiers of the 5th and 6th Battalions of the North Staffordshire Regiments. During the lull between the French assaults earlier in the year and the forthcoming Battle of Loos, the Germans had refortified their position in the area with particular care made to the fortifications known as the Hohenzollern Redoubt. On the morning of the attack, scheduled for the 12th of October, Private Joseph Barlow of Fenton recalled the scene amongst the men of the 5th North Staffords. The officers sent word along that we were to buck up, that they were proud of us and must bid us a last farewell. We raised a cheer and sent word back that we trusted them and were proud of them and would follow them anywhere. And with those parting words, the North Staffords were issued with 3 days' rations, 220 rounds of ammunition, and 3 empty sandbags each before being sent over the top. Allied artillery unleashed a hail of gas shells at the German lines, which created a dense yellow wall of smoke across no man's land. Unfortunately, the gas did not carry far, if at all, into German lines, and many British troops were poisoned due to poor planning and timing for the release of the phosphorus gas. It would take them until the next morning to reach the trenches, where they launched their assault, trying to gain a bit more ground from the German forces. But the attack was a failure. When the German defenders quickly regrouped and responded with a hail of machine gun fire, the assault ground to a halt, and the German counterattack regained ground that the North Staffords had taken only a few hours before. Of the 700 officers and men who marched out to take Hohenzollern Redoubt, barely 200 returned to their lines, with most of those fallen being killed in less than 1 hour. The poignancy of this setback for the North Staffords was brought home by the loss of one of those 700, Lieutenant Colonel John Hall Knight of Newcastle. The solicitor turned army officer took charge of the 5th Battalion in 1915 and led them off to the Western Front from their Lichfield barracks. Popular with his men, he was every bit the dashing British Army officer immortalised through the propaganda of the time. Sadly, Lieutenant Colonel Knight was reported missing after the first day of combat and later confirmed dead once it was established he did not manage to survive the first charge against the Redoubt. He was unceremoniously buried in an unmarked grave in no man's land, only identifiable to his men by the colonel's riding crop found alongside his body. When discussing the extraordinary role of North Staffordshire soldiers and regiments during the Great War, I think it's also worth considering the role of civic leaders during wartime, and in particular the contribution made by my illustrious predecessors as members of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent and the Potteries area. The role of these local MPs, both in Westminster and at the front, is a part of this patriotic impulse that so permeated the civic and social life of the Potteries. Through their actions in public life, they used their positions to rally support for the war effort and exemplify that spirit of North Staffordshire solidarity. Typical of this showing both of national and internationalist solidarity was John Ward, one of my predecessors as an MP representing Stoke-on-Trent and one-time leader of the Navvies Union. Born in Surrey in 1866, the son of a plasterer who started working life at the age of 7, John Ward had the background common amongst many of the great trade union leaders of the late 19th and early 20th century. In 1886, Ward joined the radical left-wing Social Democratic Federation and quickly engaged in illegal demonstrations for workers' rights. By 1889, he had founded the Navvies Union. As a young man, Ward exhibited the strength of convictions and independence of mind that would be the hallmark of his time in Parliament. A career that would lead him to be celebrated by the local paper as exhibiting sturdy resolution, judgment and fighting of a regular John Bull. When hostilities broke out in 1914, John Ward raised, in aid of fighting what he referred to as Prussianism, 5 Labour battalions from the members of the Navvies Union, and commissioned as a lieutenant colonel by Lord Kitchener, led them to battle in France, Italy and Russia. This was not jingoism or chauvinism as depicted in some of the literature and stage plays of the 1960s, but instead a deep-seated sense of solidarity with what he regarded as his brothers and sisters in France and Belgium. John Ward was representative of a sense of working class solidarity exhibited right across the trade union and wider labour movement in 1914. Other trade union and labour leaders stood at the forefront of a working class movement in defence of democracy. Leaders such as George Edwards of the Agricultural Labourers Union and Gas and General Workers Union leader J.R. Clines raised army volunteers from their union's members. It was Clines who declared that support for the war effort was consistent with the actions of a socialist when the choice is no longer between peace and war, but between peace and submission to the war maker. It was the internationalist solidarity displayed by working men and women, miners and dock workers, trade unionists and members of parliament that demonstrated that the labour movement was motivated by much more than jobs and wages. This was a socialism that G.D.H. Cole described as consistent with human decency and fellowship. And there is a wonderful exhibition on this strand of thinking at the People's History Museum in Manchester at the moment, looking at the labour and trade union and working class response to the outbreak of the war. But the wartime experience of the working class in Britain did not just affect their relationship with the broader international labour movement, it also transformed their relationship with the British state. While war may have unleashed the revolutionary politics of Marxist-Leninism, first with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and then across the European continent, in Britain, the Great War brought about a different kind of socialism. The First World War allowed the labour movement, both the Labour Party and trade unions, to recast its socialism and radically transform its aims and objectives. As Martin Pugh has written, participation in the war effort allowed Labour to advocate socialism from a position of strength. Now, the socialist items on the agenda after war consisted of the nationalisation of the railways, expansion of the franchise to include all working men and women, and expanded pension provision. It also produced the 1918 Education Act, which was, and I was looking at it the other day, and its main theses were about a rising participation age, curriculum reform, the threat of a successful technical education system in Germany, and stronger control of schools. And I thought very little had changed over the previous century. From the war emerged the beginnings of a labour movement more expansive than the temperance societies and Methodism, an expanded movement that would lay the foundations for the achievement of the 1945 Attlee government. In the field of female emancipation and suffrage, the Potteries, long at the forefront of female employment in the pot banks, continue to lead the way towards the equality of the sexes. As Judith Orr rightly points out, a myth that the war brought women into industrial work for the first time. In fact, many women had always worked in industry, in coal mines, in cotton mills, and in potteries. But before 1914, women were still at a disadvantage to men at work, in the home, and in politics. However, the outbreak of hostilities in 1914, followed by conscription being introduced, underlined the necessity of emancipating female work, at least as a vital part of the war effort. From munitions manufacturing to farm labour, women were now freed from the work of simply domestic service and into a vast array of new jobs. Indeed, the necessity to avoid the presence of metal in munition factories meant the removal of the much-hated corset for female factory workers, evidence of the war delivering a body blow for progressive politics. Even here, in Stoke-on-Trent, this sweeping transformation in the relationship between women and work and women in society at large was evident. The Wedgwood family led the way in this progressive impulse through the advancement of women within the workplace to fill the void left by so many of the men at the front, allowing women to take up more senior positions in the firm that had up until that point been occupied solely by their male colleagues. The example for women in the workplace was shown by Doris Audrey Wedgwood. When war broke out in 1914, the Wedgwood men dutifully went abroad to serve. Out of the need for effective management at the family firm, Doris assumed the role of company director, learning every part of the business through working hands-on from the mill and slip house upwards. After the war, Doris was promoted to company secretary, an outstanding achievement at the time, and thereby taking her place amongst the wider female workforce that had found a much stronger position within the British employment system. From pioneering women in the pot banks to the enfranchisement of women, albeit not all of them till later, under the Enfranchisement of the People Act 1918, the First World War was the crucible into which the future of so much modern Britain was forged. Symbolic of this transformation from the late 19th century liberalism towards the socialism of the early 20th century was another notable parliamentarian from North Staffordshire, Josiah Jos Wedgwood. Born in Barlaston, Staffordshire, Josiah Wedgwood IV was educated at Clifton College and then went on to study at the Royal Naval College at Greenwich, where he applied his proficiency in mathematics to the munition firm Elswick's rather than take on a job in the family business he was expected to assume. Elected to Parliament as a Liberal Party candidate for Newcastle under Lyme, Wedgwood marked himself out as a fiercely independent voice for his constituents and a tribune for radical ideas. From support for land reform to the defence of the dignity of the mentally ill, Josiah Wedgwood IV was a parliamentarian who exhibited the radical and compassionate spirit of the Potteries. When the war came in 1914, Josiah answered the call of king and country just like his fellow potters. Seeing action in France in 1914 and then the Dardanelles, Wedgwood demonstrated the courage and devotion to duty of so many of his compatriots. It was in the Dardanelles that Lieutenant Commander Wedgwood received the Distinguished Service Medal for his integral part in the Allied landings at Cape Helles, fighting alongside the volunteers of the so-called Zion Mule Corps. It was here in the heat of battle during the Gallipoli campaign that Wedgwood's philo-Semitism, that his support for the Zionist cause and the State of Israel began, where he witnessed the bravery of Jewish volunteers to the cause of the British Empire and began a lifelong mission to campaign for the establishment of a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people. In later years, this moral crusade on the part of Wedgwood was recognised by the State of Israel and its citizens through many public dedications and commemorations in his memory. From street names in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem to kibbutzes and naval vessels, the pottery's spirit of compassion and support for radical causes left its impression through the medium of the First World War in a small corner of the Middle East. From Flanders to Baku, from Siberia to Gallipoli, from Palestine to Italy, the men of the North Staffordshire regiments shed their blood in the cause of freedom and anti-imperialism. Like generations of potters before them, they wholeheartedly supported a cause that at its heart was about defending the powerless from aggressive actions of imperialist powers. From potters to bank clerks, from coal miners to pot bank owners, the people of North Staffordshire continued on a great tradition which stretched right back to the American Revolution and the campaign for the abolition in the trade in slaves of the cause of human freedom. Starting with the slave trade abolition, the American War of Independence, the people of the Potteries exhibited an element of that character that represents the finest elements of the British spirit with its commitment to liberties and the defence of those freedoms. For 300 years, that is precisely what members of the 3rd Battalion Mercian Staffords, the Staffordshire Regiment, the 38th Foot, and going as far back as the early 18th century Lillingston's Regiment, right back in the early 1700s, have been doing to protect us and our freedoms. As the 3rd Mercian Staffords have just returned from another tour of Afghanistan, a final tour, it is worth us contemplating the immense sacrifices that this regiment and its predecessors have made on our behalf, going right back to the First World War. In all, the North Staffords raised an astonishing 19 battalions during the Great War. That, as I've demonstrated, saw service in many of the major theatre deployments of that period. The sacrifices of the people of the Potteries during the First World War and many conflicts since have demonstrated that the Potteries deserve a place in the history that is more than a history of Wedgwood ceramics and bottle kilns. It is a history of a spirit of devotion to duty, compassion and defence of the oppressed that arches throughout our history, going through Lidice to recent service. It is this patriotic spirit of Potters, men and women from here in North Staffordshire that, to paraphrase Rupert Brooke, has made some corner of a foreign field that is forever the Potteries. Thank you.